Derek Vaughn thought humiliating a quiet woman in Terminal B would make him look powerful in front of his staff. But before the morning was over, the entire airport would learn a lesson no corporate handbook could ever teach. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Snow hammered against the massive glass windows of Blackstone International Airport as delayed flights stacked across the departure board in glowing red letters. Travelers dragged rolling suitcases across polished marble floors while exhausted parents carried sleeping children through the crowded terminal. Overhead announcements echoed every few minutes, mixing with the distant rumble of jet engines outside the storm-covered runways. Near Gate 24, Vivian Cole stepped quietly into the terminal wearing a cream-colored cardigan, dark jeans, and white sneakers slightly damp from the slush outside. A faded brown leather carry-on rested beside her leg as she paused beneath the departure screens, calmly studying the chaos around her. At 39, Vivian carried herself with the kind of quiet composure that most people overlooked because it didn't demand attention. Her blonde hair was tied loosely back, and her minimal makeup made her appear more like an overworked consultant than someone important. And that was usually exactly how she preferred it. Few people noticed her at first, but Derek Vaughn noticed immediately. From the elevated operations desk overlooking the terminal floor, Derek adjusted the cuff of his navy suit and watched her with visible irritation. At 46, he had built his reputation inside the airport on control, precision, and authority. Employees feared him because he treated every delay like a personal insult and every confused traveler like an inconvenience. This morning's snowstorm had already pushed him dangerously close to losing his temper, and the sight of another casually dressed passenger standing near the priority check-in area immediately caught his attention. He descended the escalator with fast, sharp steps, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor like warning shots. Two junior employees followed nervously behind him, carrying tablets and radios. Vivian remained focused on her phone, calmly reviewing an email while travelers rushed around her in frustration. Derek stopped several feet away and gave her a practiced corporate smile that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Ma'am," he said sharply, "this area is reserved for executive travelers and priority passengers only." Vivian slowly looked up from her phone. Her expression remained calm. "I'm aware," she answered softly. Derek's smile tightened. "Then I'll need you to move to the standard waiting area immediately." Nearby passengers glanced toward the exchange. Vivian looked briefly around the crowded terminal before returning her eyes to Derek. "I'm waiting for someone," she replied politely. Derek crossed his arms. "Unless you have executive credentials, you cannot remain here." One of the younger employees behind him shifted uncomfortably. Vivian reached into her coat pocket, but before she could respond, Derek continued, speaking louder now, making sure nearby travelers could hear him. "This section is not for the general public." Several people turned fully toward them. A hush slowly spread across the immediate area as curious passengers sensed public embarrassment unfolding in real time. Vivian noticed the attention instantly. So did Derek. And strangely, he seemed to enjoy it. "I don't want to create a scene," Vivian said calmly. "Neither do I," Derek replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But airport security policies exist for a reason." Vivian studied him quietly for a moment. Not angry, not defensive, just observant. The storm outside intensified, rattling the tall terminal windows while another cancellation alert flashed across the departure board overhead. Around them, frustrated travelers groaned in disappointment. Derek pointed toward the crowded general seating area near the food court. "You can wait over there with everyone else." The younger female employee standing behind him looked down awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Vivian slowly picked up her worn leather bag. "All right," she said softly. But before she could take a single step, her phone began vibrating again. Derek glanced briefly at the illuminated screen and frowned. The caller ID displayed only 3 words. Board of Directors. Vivian looked at the screen for 2 silent seconds before pressing decline. And somewhere above the storm-covered runway, Another arriving aircraft began its slow descent toward the airport, completely unaware that the woman standing quietly beside Gate 24 was about to change everything inside that terminal. The snowfall outside thickened into a blinding white curtain as airport employees scrambled across Terminal B, trying to contain the growing disaster unfolding across Blackstone International. Delays had stretched past 3 hours. Families argued beside charging stations. Business travelers paced near the departure boards while airline representatives repeated apologies through strained smiles. Yet in the middle of all the noise, Vivian Cole sat quietly near the executive lounge entrance with her weathered leather bag resting beside her chair and her hands folded calmly in her lap. She looked nothing like the wealthy passengers now crowding the priority area in designer coats and expensive luggage. And to Derek Vaughn, that remained a problem he intended to solve. From across the terminal, he watched her with increasing irritation while speaking sharply into his radio. "Why is she still sitting there?" he muttered under his breath. One of the junior supervisors shifted nervously beside him. "Sir, she has not caused any trouble." Derek turned cold eyes toward the young employee. "That is not the point." His jaw tightened as another cancellation announcement echoed overhead, followed by frustrated groans from the crowd. This storm had already placed airport leadership under pressure from corporate headquarters, and Derek had no patience left for anyone he considered out of place, especially someone calm, especially someone who did not seem intimidated by him. Across the terminal, Vivian glanced once more at her vibrating phone before silencing it again. Her expression never changed, but her eyes quietly tracked everything happening around her. 2 gate agents were arguing beside a frozen boarding scanner. A maintenance worker struggled to calm an elderly couple after another gate change. Near the coffee stand, a mother bounced a crying toddler while staring hopelessly at the departure screens. Vivian noticed every detail. Years earlier, before private jets and boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations, she had spent nights sleeping inside airports exactly like this one while trying to keep her struggling startup alive. She remembered surviving on vending machine coffee and airport sandwiches during back-to-back investor meetings that usually ended in rejection. She remembered executives dismissing her before she even spoke because she looked too young, too quiet, too ordinary. And somehow, those memories had never left her. "Ma'am." Derek's voice suddenly interrupted the silence again. Vivian slowly looked up. Derek stood over her now, with 2 airport security officers nearby. Several passengers immediately stopped pretending not to watch. The female employee from earlier stood farther back near the operations desk, her face tense with concern. "I already explained the policy," Derek said firmly. "This seating area is reserved for executive travelers only." Vivian remained composed. "I understand. Then I am asking you one final time to relocate." Vivian glanced briefly toward the crowded public seating area where exhausted travelers sat shoulder to shoulder beneath flickering television screens. Then she looked back at Derek. "I am waiting for a meeting," she answered softly. Derek gave a humorless laugh. "A meeting?" The sarcasm in his voice drew uncomfortable reactions from nearby passengers. One businessman lowered his newspaper. A flight attendant paused beside the escalator. Even the security officers exchanged subtle glances. Derek stepped slightly closer. "Look around you," he said. "This airport handles executives, investors, professional athletes, government officials. We maintain standards here." Vivian studied him quietly for several seconds. The storm continued pounding the windows behind them while blue emergency lights reflected faintly across the polished marble floor. "Standards matter," she finally replied. "You are absolutely right about that." Derek mistook her calmness for surrender. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he gestured toward the exit corridor. "Then let us not make this more uncomfortable than it already is." But before Vivian could respond, another employee hurried toward Derek carrying a tablet. "Sir," the man whispered urgently. "Corporate operations just called again asking if the terminal has been secured for the board arrival." Derek exhaled sharply. "Tell them we are handling it." The employee hesitated. "They said the new executive already landed 20 minutes ago." Derek frowned. "Impossible. Nobody came through private arrival." The employee swallowed nervously. Apparently, she declined the escort service. Derek rolled his eyes in frustration. "Wonderful. Another entitled executive making everyone's lives harder. Nearby, Vivian lowered her gaze toward the floor for a brief moment, almost hiding the faint smile that touched the corner of her mouth. Then, for the first time since arriving at the airport, she slowly stood to her feet. And the moment she did, the entire energy inside the terminal seemed to shift. The moment Vivian Cole rose from her chair, conversations near Gate 24 faded into uneasy silence. Derek Vaughn straightened instinctively, expecting resistance at last, but instead she simply adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored cardigan and lifted her worn leather carry-on from the floor. Calm, controlled, completely unshaken. That composure unsettled him far more than anger would have. Around them, exhausted travelers slowed their movements to watch the strange tension unfolding beneath the cold blue terminal lights. Snow continued swirling outside the towering windows, while another delayed flight warning flashed across the departure boards overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a child cried softly beside a vending machine, but near the executive lounge entrance, the atmosphere had become almost unnaturally still. Derek folded his arms tighter across his chest. "Thank you for cooperating," he said, though his voice carried the smug satisfaction of someone convinced he had just won. Vivian looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. "Do you always treat passengers this way?" Derek gave a short laugh. "Passengers who ignore airport policy?" "Yes." One of the security officers shifted awkwardly beside him. The younger female employee near the operations desk lowered her eyes again, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange. Vivian glanced briefly toward the departure screens overhead, where nearly every flight now glowed red with delays and cancellations. "You have hundreds of stranded travelers," she said softly. "Families sleeping on terminal floors. Gate systems malfunctioning. Staff overwhelmed. But this," she looked back at Derek, "is where you decided to spend your attention." Derek's expression hardened instantly. "You do not get to lecture me about airport operations." Vivian did not respond immediately. That silence somehow made Derek even more defensive. He stepped closer, lowering his voice while still making certain nearby travelers could hear every word. "People like you walk into places like this every day thinking confidence alone gives you access. It does not." A businessman standing near the coffee kiosk frowned slightly at the comment. An older woman near the charging station slowly removed her headphones, listening now with open concern. Vivian remained perfectly still. "People like me," she repeated calmly. Derek realized too late how the phrase sounded, but pride pushed him forward anyway. "This airport serves high-level clientele," he said sharply. "Executives, investors, serious professionals." Vivian's blue eyes remained steady on his. "I see." Derek gestured toward the crowded terminal behind her. "Now if you would please move along, we can avoid involving additional security." The female employee suddenly stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," she interrupted quietly, "maybe we should verify her meeting first." Derek snapped his head toward her so quickly she immediately regretted speaking. "Emily," he said coldly, "return to your station." The young employee froze. "But corporate did mention," "I said return to your station." Emily stepped back in silence, her face flushing with embarrassment. Vivian noticed the exchange instantly, and for the first time, something faintly sad crossed her expression. Not anger, disappointment. The kind that came from recognizing a leadership culture broken far deeper than one arrogant supervisor. Another vibration buzzed softly from Vivian's phone. This time she looked at the screen longer. Derek caught only fragments of the message before the display dimmed again. "Entire board waiting. Where are you?" "Terminal security issue escalating." Derek exhaled impatiently. "If you are trying to impress people by pretending to be important, it is not working." Vivian slowly slid the phone back into her pocket. "Pretending?" she asked gently. Derek gave a dismissive shrug. "Look around. Real executives do not arrive carrying old luggage and wearing discount sneakers." A few nervous chuckles escaped from nearby passengers before quickly dying away beneath the growing tension. Vivian lowered her gaze briefly toward her worn white sneakers dusted lightly with melted snow. Then she looked back up at him with complete calm. "Interesting," she said softly. "You can tell someone's value by their shoes?" Derek smirked. "Usually." The room seemed to hold its breath after that. Snow battered the windows harder now, while emergency crews moved across the icy runway outside, in flashing amber lights. Somewhere overhead, an intercom announcement crackled with another apology for operational disruptions. Then suddenly, from across the terminal entrance, 3 black SUVs pulled sharply to the curb outside the glass doors. Several airport directors hurried inside through the snowfall, their polished shoes splashing through slush as they scanned the terminal with visible urgency. Derek frowned immediately. The older man leading the group looked pale, panicked, and the moment his eyes landed on Vivian Cole standing beside Gate 24, he stopped walking altogether. The older airport director froze the instant he recognized Vivian Cole standing near Gate 24, surrounded by security officers and frustrated travelers. Snow clung to the shoulders of his black overcoat as he stared across the terminal with visible disbelief. Behind him, several executives from airport operations slowed their pace, confused at first by his sudden reaction. Then they followed his line of sight toward Vivian, and one by one, their expressions changed completely. The tension inside the terminal shifted so sharply it almost felt physical. Derek Vaughn frowned, still unaware of the disaster forming around him. "Sir," he called toward the approaching group, forcing confidence into his voice. "We are handling a situation involving unauthorized access to the executive waiting area." The airport director barely looked at him. His eyes remained locked on Vivian as he crossed the marble floor with hurried steps. Travelers nearby instinctively moved aside, sensing something important unfolding. Even the security officers straightened nervously. Vivian stood perfectly calm beside her worn leather bag while the storm rattled the massive terminal windows behind her. The older man finally reached her and stopped abruptly. "Ms. Cole," he said breathlessly, "we have been trying to locate you for nearly 30 minutes. The room went silent. Derek blinked once. "Locate her," he repeated slowly. Vivian offered a small polite smile. The weather delayed the taxi path. The airport director looked horrified. "We had executive escorts waiting at private arrival." "I know," Vivian answered gently. "I preferred to walk through the terminal myself." Behind Derek, Emily's face drained of color as realization began dawning across the operations team. The airport director removed his glasses nervously. "Ms. Cole, the board members are already assembled upstairs. Everyone is waiting for your operational review." Derek stared at Vivian as if hearing a foreign language. "Operational review?" he whispered. The older man finally turned toward him, confusion quickly becoming alarm. "Mr. Vaughn," he said carefully, "you do understand who this is, correct?" Derek's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Vivian quietly reached into her coat pocket and removed a slim silver business card. She handed it to the director, who immediately accepted it with both hands. Derek caught the logo instantly. Cole Aeronautics Group, one of the largest aviation infrastructure companies in the country. His stomach tightened. The airport director spoke carefully now, almost cautiously. "Ms. Cole finalized the acquisition agreement yesterday evening." A hush fell over the terminal. Nearby travelers exchanged confused whispers while employees stared openly now. Derek felt heat rising beneath his collar as the pieces finally began connecting in his mind. The delayed board arrival, the emergency operational meeting, the executive escort requests, the constant phone calls. His pulse quickened. "Acquisition," Emily whispered under her breath. The director nodded once. "Effective this morning, Blackstone International Airport officially transitioned under Cole Aeronautics executive management." Derek's face lost color completely. Vivian remained composed, her voice still soft and calm despite the growing shock surrounding them. "I wanted to see how the airport functioned during operational stress before the formal meeting." Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Derek suddenly became painfully aware of every word he had spoken during the past hour. "People like you. Real executives. Discount sneakers." The memories hit him one after another like collapsing dominoes. Around the terminal, employees lowered their eyes while passengers watched with open fascination. Even the security officers stepped subtly farther away from Derek now. The marble floor beneath him suddenly felt unstable. Vivian glanced toward the crowded terminal where exhausted families still sat waiting beside charging stations and delayed gates. "Your staff is overwhelmed," she said quietly to the director. "Communication systems are failing. Gate coordination is collapsing under weather pressure, and frontline employees are receiving almost no leadership support." Her voice never rose, yet every sentence landed with crushing precision. The director nodded nervously while another executive quickly typed notes into a tablet. Derek swallowed hard. "Ms. Cole," he began weakly, "if there has been some misunderstanding." Vivian finally looked directly at him again. Calm, steady, unreadable. "There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Vaughn." The silence afterward felt enormous. Snow continued sweeping across the runway outside, while flashing amber lights reflected against the giant windows. Somewhere in the distance, another boarding cancellation announcement echoed through the terminal. But near Gate 24, nobody cared about delayed flights anymore. Because the woman Derek Vaughn had spent the entire morning trying to remove from the executive area had just become the most powerful person inside the entire airport. For several long seconds, Derek Vaughn could not speak. The noise of the airport seemed to disappear around him as his mind replayed every cold remark he had made to Vivian Cole since the moment she entered Terminal B. The executive waiting area suddenly felt painfully small beneath the bright white lighting, and every pair of eyes in the terminal now seemed fixed directly on him. Travelers who had once looked away awkwardly were openly watching now. Airport employees stood frozen beside their stations. Even the rolling sound of suitcases across the marble floor had faded into the background beneath the crushing silence surrounding Gate 24. Vivian remained perfectly composed in the center of it all. No smug smile, no raised voice, no dramatic reaction. Somehow that calmness made everything far worse. The airport director cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Cole," he said carefully, "the boardroom is prepared whenever you are ready." Vivian glanced briefly across the terminal instead of answering immediately. Her eyes moved over the exhausted travelers sleeping near charging stations, the frustrated gate agents struggling with system failures, and the overwhelmed employees trying to manage growing lines of angry passengers. Then her gaze settled once more on Derek. "Before the meeting," she said softly, "I would like to understand something." Derek swallowed hard. "Of course," he managed weakly. Vivian tilted her head slightly. "How long have you supervised terminal operations here?" 8 years, Derek answered quietly. 8 years, she repeated, thoughtfully. "That is a long time to shape a workplace culture." Nobody moved. The airport director looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely. Nearby employees exchanged nervous glances but remained silent. Vivian stepped slowly toward the operations desk, her white sneakers barely making a sound against the polished marble floor. "When I walked into this terminal today," she continued calmly, "I watched gate agents trying to calm stranded families with almost no support from leadership. I saw maintenance crews handling storm issues while managers argued about appearances instead of solutions. And I watched employees become afraid to speak because they were worried about embarrassing someone above them." Emily lowered her eyes immediately. Derek noticed. Vivian noticed too. "Leadership pressure during a storm is difficult," Vivian said. "I understand that." For one hopeful second, Derek thought perhaps she was giving him a path out of the humiliation. Then she continued, "But pressure does not create character. It reveals it." The words landed across the terminal like ice water. Derek's face flushed deep red, while several employees quietly looked away. Vivian's voice never rose above calm conversation level, yet somehow every sentence echoed through the silent waiting area more powerfully than shouting ever could. "You evaluated people based on clothing," she said. "You dismissed concerns from your own staff. And you chose public embarrassment over professional problem solving because you believed authority meant control." Derek opened his mouth slightly. "Ms. Cole, I truly did not realize that I was important," she interrupted gently. Derek stopped speaking immediately. The silence afterward was brutal. Vivian looked toward the giant snow-covered windows for a moment before speaking again. "That is exactly the problem." Snow continued swirling outside beneath flashing runway lights, while another delayed departure alert flickered across the screens overhead. Somewhere farther down the terminal, a little girl laughed briefly as her father spun her suitcase around to distract her from the long wait. The simple sound somehow made the entire moment feel even quieter. Vivian turned back toward Derek. "Every traveler who walks through this airport matters," she said. "Not because of titles, not because of wealth, because they are people." Emily looked up slowly, her expression filled with stunned admiration. The airport director removed his glasses again, visibly uncomfortable beneath the weight of the moment. Derek's confidence had completely collapsed now. The sharp posture, the polished authority, the carefully rehearsed professionalism he had worn all morning had vanished entirely. He looked smaller somehow. Human. Frightened. "I am sorry," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Vivian studied him quietly for several seconds. Around them, the terminal remained frozen in silence. Waiting. Watching. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried no cruelty at all. "I believe you are sorry," she answered softly. "The question is whether you understand why." Derek lowered his eyes toward the marble floor without answering. And in that moment, for the first time all morning, the people standing nearby no longer saw a powerful operations supervisor controlling the airport. They saw a man realizing too late that respect cannot be demanded through authority. It can only be earned through humility. The silence surrounding Gate 24 lingered long after Vivian Cole finished speaking. No one rushed to fill it. No one dared. Travelers who had once stared with curiosity now watched with something entirely different in their eyes. Respect. The kind that appears quietly when dignity reveals itself without needing to announce its presence. Snow continued drifting across the runways outside the giant terminal windows, while flashing amber lights reflected softly across the polished marble floor. Somewhere in the distance, another boarding cancellation echoed through the speakers, but near the executive waiting area, the atmosphere had completely changed. Derek Vaughn remained motionless with his gaze lowered, the confidence that had once defined every movement now stripped away beneath the weight of public realization. Vivian adjusted the strap of her worn leather carry-on and finally looked toward Emily, the young employee, standing nervously beside the operations desk. "What is your position here?" Vivian asked gently. Emily blinked, clearly startled to be addressed directly. "Junior Terminal Coordinator," she answered quietly. Vivian nodded once. "How long have you worked at Blackstone?" "Almost 11 months. And during weather emergencies," Vivian continued calmly. "How often are frontline staff included in operational decisions?" Emily hesitated. Derek shifted uncomfortably beside them. The airport director looked down at his tablet, as if suddenly fascinated by the screen. Vivian noticed everyone's hesitation instantly. "You do not need to be afraid to answer honestly," she said softly. Emily swallowed. "Usually we just follow instructions from supervisors." Vivian tilted her head slightly. "Even when those instructions are not helping passengers?" The young employee hesitated again before finally answering in a near whisper. "Sometimes people are too afraid to speak up." The words settled heavily over the group. Vivian looked toward the crowded terminal where exhausted families still waited beside overloaded charging stations and delayed departure gates. "That," she said quietly, "is how leadership failures spread." Derek closed his eyes briefly. Every sentence seemed to expose another crack in the culture he had helped create over 8 years inside the airport. Vivian slowly walked a few steps toward the departure screens overhead, while several executives instinctively followed her. "A company can survive storms," she continued. "It can survive delays, financial pressure, public criticism, even operational failures." She turned back toward them. "But the moment employees become afraid to speak honestly, the entire system begins collapsing from the inside." Nobody argued because nobody could. Around the terminal, airport staff listened silently now. Gate agents, maintenance workers, security personnel. Many of them looked stunned simply hearing someone at the executive level speak about them as human beings instead of numbers on a staffing report. Vivian noticed an exhausted gate attendant rubbing her temples near a broken scanner station. Another employee sat briefly against the wall trying to calm herself before returning to work. She saw things Derek had stopped seeing years ago. "Ms. Cole," the airport director said carefully, "the board is prepared to begin the acquisition transition whenever you are ready." Vivian glanced once toward the crowded terminal before answering. "The board can wait another 15 minutes. The executives exchanged nervous looks immediately. Nobody was accustomed to delaying a corporate transition meeting involving billions of dollars. But Vivian simply walked toward the nearest customer service counter and rested her hand lightly against the marble surface. "Bring coffee stations to gates 12 through 30, she instructed calmly. "Families have been stranded there for hours." She looked toward another supervisor. "Open the unused conference lounges for elderly passengers and children." then toward the maintenance lead. And someone needs to manually coordinate boarding communication because your automated gate system is confusing people faster than the weather itself. Employees stared at her almost in disbelief. Not because the ideas were revolutionary, because they were obvious, human. The kind of decisions everyone on the terminal floor had been quietly hoping leadership would notice all morning. Derek slowly lifted his eyes toward her. "You noticed all of that just by sitting here?" he asked quietly before he could stop himself. Vivian met his gaze calmly. Leadership begins by paying attention. The answer hit harder than humiliation ever could. Nearby, Emily looked down as emotion briefly crossed her face. The airport director immediately began relaying Vivian's instructions through his radio, while supervisors hurried across the terminal with renewed urgency. Slowly, the atmosphere inside Blackstone International began shifting from chaos toward coordination. And for the first time that entire morning, the employees working beneath the cold airport lights no longer looked defeated. Because one quiet woman wearing snow-dusted sneakers had walked through the terminal and reminded everyone what real leadership was supposed to look like. Within 20 minutes, the atmosphere inside Blackstone International Airport began transforming in ways the employees had not seen in years. Portable coffee stations appeared near crowded boarding areas. Airport staff distributed blankets to stranded passengers sleeping beside charging outlets. Elderly travelers were quietly escorted into unused executive lounges, while gate agents received direct communication updates instead of conflicting instructions through overloaded systems. The terminal was still crowded. Flights were still delayed. Snow still hammered the runways outside beneath swirling gray skies. But for the first time all morning, the chaos no longer felt hopeless. And everyone inside the airport knew exactly who had changed it. Vivian Cole moved calmly through the terminal without entourage or ceremony, stopping occasionally to speak with exhausted employees and frustrated travelers alike. She listened more than she talked. That alone shocked people. Executives usually arrived inside airports surrounded by assistants, security teams, and carefully rehearsed statements. Vivian walked alone carrying her weathered leather bag and asking frontline workers questions nobody in upper management had bothered asking in years. How long have passengers been waiting here? Which systems keep failing first during weather emergencies? What slows your teams down the most? Employees answered carefully at first, still nervous about speaking openly. But Vivian listened without interrupting, and slowly the fear began fading from their voices. Near Gate 18, a maintenance supervisor explained how outdated communication software created confusion every time severe weather hit. At Gate 22, a gate attendant admitted employees often skipped breaks because staffing shortages left nobody available to rotate coverage. Vivian absorbed every detail quietly, her expression thoughtful beneath the cold white airport lights. Derek Vaughn followed several steps behind during most of it, silent and visibly shaken. The authority he once carried so confidently through the terminal had dissolved completely into uneasy self-awareness. Every time Vivian stopped to help solve another operational issue, he seemed to understand more clearly how little he had truly been leading. Near the customer service center, Vivian paused beside Emily, who was helping a stranded family rebook a canceled connection flight to Denver. The young coordinator looked startled when Vivian approached. "How long have you been assisting this family?" Vivian asked gently. Emily glanced toward the tired parents standing nearby with two small children wrapped in airport blankets. "Almost 40 minutes, she admitted. The system kept rejecting the transfer because of weather routing." Vivian studied the screen for a moment before calmly pointing toward a manual override authorization hidden inside the interface menu. Emily blinked in surprise. "I did not even know that option existed." Vivian smiled faintly. Most executives never bother learning the software employees actually use. Emily let out the smallest nervous laugh before quickly stopping herself. But Vivian's expression remained warm. "You spoke up earlier when nobody else would," she said quietly. Emily looked embarrassed. "I probably should not have interrupted Mr. Vaughn like that." Vivian shook her head gently. "Good organizations survive because people speak up when something feels wrong." Those words lingered heavily in Emily's mind long after Vivian moved farther down the terminal. Nearby employees had overheard them too. Slowly, The fear-driven atmosphere Derek had built over years inside airport operations began cracking apart beneath something unfamiliar. Respect without intimidation. Leadership without humiliation. The difference was impossible not to feel. Across the terminal, the airport director hurried toward Vivian again, holding a tablet filled with updated operational reports. Passenger complaints are already dropping, he said almost incredulously. Staff response times have improved nearly 30% in the last hour. Vivian glanced briefly at the numbers before returning the tablet. People perform better when they feel supported instead of threatened. Derek heard every word. The shame on his face deepened visibly. He finally stepped forward carefully, his voice quieter than anyone in the terminal had ever heard before. "Ms. Cole," he said, slowly. "I spent years believing control was the same thing as leadership." Vivian looked at him calmly, but did not answer immediately. Snow continued falling outside, while airport crews worked beneath flashing runway lights in the freezing darkness. Travelers hurried past with rolling suitcases, but many still glanced toward Vivian as they passed, recognizing now that something unusual had happened inside Blackstone International that morning. Derek swallowed hard before continuing. "I thought authority meant keeping people in line." Vivian studied him for several silent seconds. Then she answered softly enough that only those closest could hear. "The strongest leaders do not make people feel small, Mr. Vaughn." Her eyes shifted briefly toward the exhausted employees working across the terminal. "They make people feel seen." The terminal fell quiet once more. And somewhere deep inside the airport operations team, something much more important than management had started changing. By early afternoon, the storm over Blackstone International Airport had finally begun weakening. But inside the terminal, something far more significant than the weather had shifted. Employees moved with renewed focus. Communication between gates had stabilized. Families stranded for hours were receiving updates instead of vague apologies. Even frustrated passengers seemed calmer beneath the softened glow of the departure boards. The airport was still under pressure, but no longer collapsing beneath it. And everyone knew why. Vivian Cole stood quietly near the operations balcony overlooking the terminal floor while executives gathered behind her with tablets, reports, and nervous expressions. Below them, travelers crossed the marble concourse carrying coffee cups and winter coats, while snowplows moved steadily beyond the giant windows outside. The airport director approached carefully. "The board members are ready upstairs whenever you wish to begin," he said. Vivian nodded slightly, but kept her eyes on the employees working below. Gate attendants helping elderly passengers. Custodians clearing melted snow near the entrances. Coordinators guiding delayed travelers through rerouted departures. People Derek Vaughn had once viewed as background noise. "Do you know what most companies misunderstand?" Vivian asked quietly without turning around. None of the executives answered. "They think culture begins in boardrooms." She finally looked back toward them. "It begins in moments when nobody important is supposed to be watching." The words settled heavily over the group. Derek stood near the edge of the balcony several feet behind the others, silent and visibly exhausted. Hours earlier, he had controlled the terminal with sharp commands and intimidation. Now he looked like a man confronting the ruins of everything he thought leadership meant. Vivian studied him briefly before addressing the group again. "I did not walk through this airport today searching for perfection," she said calmly. "Operational problems can be fixed. Storm systems pass. Technology can be replaced." Her eyes shifted toward the busy terminal below. "But the way people are treated when they seem powerless tells you everything about an organization." Nobody disagreed because everyone had witnessed it happen in real time. The airport director cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Cole," he began carefully, "regarding terminal leadership restructuring." His voice trailed off awkwardly as several executives glanced toward Derek. The meaning was obvious. Vivian remained quiet for several moments before finally speaking. "Public humiliation is not leadership," she said softly. Derek lowered his eyes immediately. "Accountability is." The room fell silent again. Even the executives seemed uncertain what would happen next. Vivian stepped away from the balcony railing and faced Derek directly for the first time since the revelation near Gate 24. "Mr. Vaughn," she said calmly, "effective immediately, you will be placed on administrative review pending a full operational culture assessment." Derek nodded once without protest. He looked strangely relieved just hearing honesty instead of cruelty. I understand, he answered quietly. Vivian's expression remained composed. You built systems that prioritized authority over humanity. That cannot continue. Derek swallowed hard before finally meeting her eyes again. No, he admitted softly. It cannot. Around them, nobody moved. There was no dramatic firing, no shouting, no revenge disguised as justice. Somehow that restraint made the moment even more powerful. Emily stood near the operations entrance listening silently while several other employees exchanged stunned looks. They had expected anger, public punishment. Instead, they were witnessing something almost none of them had experienced from leadership before. Dignity. Vivian glanced toward Emily. How long until your management certification program begins? Emily blinked in surprise. Next month, she answered cautiously. Vivian nodded. Good. I would like you included in the terminal operations restructuring team. Emily stared at her in complete disbelief. Me? Vivian smiled faintly. You spoke honestly under pressure. That matters. Emotion flashed briefly across Emily's face before she quickly composed herself. Around the balcony, several employees quietly exchanged hopeful glances for the first time all day. Vivian turned back toward the terminal below, where travelers continued moving beneath the glowing departure boards. The storm outside had slowed to a gentle snowfall now, soft white flakes drifting across the runways beneath the fading afternoon light. Airports are strange places, Vivian said quietly. People arrive carrying stress, grief, excitement, exhaustion, hope, sometimes all at once. Her gaze remained steady on the terminal floor. The people working here may be the only kindness someone experiences that entire day. The silence after those words felt almost sacred. And standing beneath the cold corporate lights of Blackstone International Airport, everyone listening suddenly understood that Vivian Cole had never truly been evaluating flight systems or weather response procedures that morning. She had been evaluating character. By evening, the storm over Blackstone International Airport had finally passed. Snow still covered the edges of the runways in soft white layers, but the skies beyond the giant terminal windows had begun clearing into pale shades of blue and silver. Inside the airport, delayed flights slowly resumed boarding while tired travelers gathered their luggage with visible relief. The chaos that had consumed the terminal that morning was fading at last, replaced by something calmer, something steadier. Near Gate 24, employees moved with a different energy now. Gate agents communicated directly with one another instead of waiting fearfully for approval from above. Maintenance crews coordinated smoothly with terminal supervisors. Even the atmosphere between employees had changed. The tension that once lived in every hurried glance and cautious conversation had weakened beneath something unfamiliar but powerful. Trust. Vivian Cole stood quietly beside the giant departure windows overlooking the runway lights glowing against the snow. Her cream-colored cardigan still carried faint traces of melted snow near the sleeves, and her worn leather bag rested beside her feet exactly as it had that morning. To most people passing through the terminal now, she still looked ordinary. And perhaps that was the point. The airport director approached carefully, holding a fresh operational report. Passenger recovery rates are improving faster than expected, he said respectfully. Staff morale surveys already show immediate changes. Vivian accepted the report with only a brief glance before handing it back. Numbers matter, she said softly. But people remember how they were treated long after reports are forgotten. Nearby, Emily was helping an elderly couple print updated boarding passes, while another coordinator distributed meal vouchers to stranded travelers. The young employee looked more confident now, her shoulders no longer tense with fear each time a supervisor walked by. Vivian noticed immediately. Derek Vaughn noticed too. He stood several feet away near the operations entrance, no longer wearing the sharp authority that once defined him. Without the arrogance, he looked older somehow, quieter, human. For most of the afternoon, he had assisted employees directly instead of giving orders, helping coordinate gate transfers and passenger movement without once raising his voice. Several workers had noticed. So had Vivian. After a long silence, Derek slowly approached her. Ms. Cole, he said carefully, I spent years believing professionalism meant distance. Vivian turned toward him calmly. A lot of leaders make that mistake. Derek nodded faintly. I thought if employees feared disappointing me, they would perform better. He glanced across the terminal floor where airport staff now worked together beneath the softened evening lights. But fear only taught people to stay silent. Vivian's expression softened slightly. And silence is dangerous in places responsible for thousands of people every day. Derek lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. I cannot undo how I treated people. No, Vivian answered gently. But you can decide what kind of person you become after realizing it. The words hung quietly between them while snowplows moved slowly across the distant runway outside. Derek looked toward the employees working across the terminal, many of whom had spent years avoiding eye contact whenever he walked past. Do you really believe people can change? He asked quietly. Vivian looked toward Emily helping the elderly couple before answering. Only when they stopped defending who they were. The terminal fell silent around them once more, though this time the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt reflective, peaceful. A final boarding announcement echoed softly overhead as passengers began lining up for the first fully restored departures of the evening. Families gathered their coats. Business travelers closed laptops. Children pressed their faces against the giant windows watching airplanes taxi beneath the fading snowfall. Life inside Blackstone International was moving forward again. Vivian finally lifted her leather bag from the floor. The airport director immediately straightened. Your car is waiting downstairs whenever you are ready. Vivian nodded politely before taking one last look across the terminal. Employees were smiling now, talking openly, helping one another without fear hanging over every interaction. The airport was still imperfect. It always would be. But something important had changed there that day. Not because a billionaire executive arrived with power, but because one quiet woman chose to remind people what dignity looked like. Vivian walked toward the private elevators without ceremony, her white sneakers moving softly across the marble floor while the terminal lights reflected against the polished surface beneath her feet. Several employees watched her go in silence. And long after she disappeared from view, the people inside Blackstone International Airport would remember the winter storm when the most powerful person in the building arrived dressed like an ordinary traveler and revealed that true class is not measured by wealth, titles, or authority. It is measured by how you treat people when you believe they have nothing to offer.